Well, my friends, it's Mother's Day this morning. And I have, as I mentioned at the beginning of our service today, as many Mother's Day Sundays as I have preached and served as a minister over 13 years now, I have never actually preached on Mother's Day a Mother's Day sermon. I gave a few sermons while I was pregnant about becoming a mother, but never anything fully dedicated to the feminine aspects of God, or the feminine dimensions of our earthly and spiritual lives. And honestly, I don't know that I would be speaking about it today had I not been nudged a bit. There was an article recently in our church newsletter in the Messenger by a member of the Hillside Community Church in El Cerrito about the Creatress that we read in our reading from Divine Love and Wisdom. A lovely article about how we can begin to use this feminine language, and that this can be a part of our transformation of community. And then many of you were here when Kent Rogers visited a few weeks ago, and he spoke with passion about the divine feminine coming into the world. They both shared what I thought to be powerful and thoughtful reflections, but I realized I approached both of those with a little bit of skepticism, a bit of a feeling that I, as a woman, should maybe be speaking to these larger theological questions, and a curious wondering about why I was surrounded by so many men's voices on the subject. All this is to say that I was motivated to take a stab at bringing my theological training and my own experience in the world as a cisgender woman to bear on this topic of God and gender, of the presence and the absence of femaleness in our biblical tradition, our Swedenborgian tradition, and then our spiritual lives as a whole. To give you a taste of my experience, I would begin by saying that I've spent most of my life feeling quite empowered as a woman, and not dwelling too much, or honestly noticing too much, how my gender allowed me to be received or not received into the world. I was raised by a very strong, empowered mother. I was told that I could do most things that I might wish. I was brought into a church community where I was stood on equal footing with my male counterparts. My parents gave me a strong belief in myself, and this served me, making me often immune to situations where I could have felt persecuted, but instead remained probably just contentedly ignorant that I was being in any way maligned. As I've gotten older, for good or for ill, I've become more aware of when I am being treated differently because of my gender. Seen not as a minister, but a female minister. Seen not as someone exhibiting leadership, but as someone who is pushy and demanding. It doesn't happen all the time, or even often, but it does happen. And it's perhaps for this reason that I haven't before preached a Mother's Day sermon or a message about the divine feminine at all. I realize there exists in me some long embedded fear that if I speak on this topic, then somehow this will become the only topic on which I have any authority to speak. Just the fact that I realize I carry this fear is evidence, perhaps, that I am more impacted by the realities of sexism than I'd ever like to acknowledge. It's the realities of sexism, of our patriarchal society, of misogyny, that are in large part to blame for my hesitancy to even try to speak to things like the feminine nature of God. Because when I go there, it brings light to the deep chasm that exists within our religious traditions, where half of the human race is entirely left out or used as an illustration instead of a self-defining character, often present only in the role of counterpart or wife to the true hero. We are a people of the word. I am a minister ordained in a religious tradition grounded in the biblical story. And the biblical story is set in a time and a place where we would hardly recognize ourselves today. A place none of us would be able to find ourselves. In this culture, gender was a defining birthright that dictated everything about what was possible for a person in life. Who would have power and who would be powerless? Who could speak and who would remain silent? Whose name would be remembered and whose would be forgotten? Yes, there are exceptions. There are women who do make their mark and stand out in the story, but rarely as leaders of their own narrative. And yes, there are some feminine images used to describe God, like the brooding hen that we read this morning. But these are in the extreme minority, 0.1 of 1%. And the same exception to the rule occurs in Swedenborg's writings that are set in a culture different from the biblical story, but still vastly different from our own. In Swedenborg's writings, we get this one reference in Divine Love and Wisdom, number 33, where instead of referring to the creator, Swedenborg uses the feminine term of the word, creatrix, or creatus. He uses this word without explanation as almost an aside, as if it in no way is set apart from all of the other references to God that he makes in the male form. Now, in general, much of what Swedenborg says about gender is beyond his time, certainly beyond his 18th century Western European cultural framework. He does speak of the equality and complementary of the sexes, the necessity of both. But he often illustrates his points using very culturally embedded images. Women often show up doing lots of needlepoint. And there's one such reference that has been lifted out above many to describe the differences of women and in some parts of our church to limit their involvement. I want to read this passage to you. It comes from Spiritual Experiences, number 5938, and it is titled, Women Who Preach. Women who think in the way men do on religious subjects and talk much about them, and still more if they preach in meetings, do away with the feminine nature, which is affectional, owing to which they must be with married men. They also become material, so that affection perishes and their interiors are closed. They also begin to develop a tendency as regards the thoughts to take up with crazes, which takes place because the affection, being then destroyed, causes the intellectual to be crazy. In outward form, indeed, they are still able to appear like other women. In a word, they become sensual in the last degree. Woman belongs to the home, and she becomes of a different nature where she engages in preaching. Woman belongs to the home. Not only am I left out of this passage and much of Swedenborg's worldview, but men who choose to stay home and care for their children and to care for their homes are left out. The strict binary model of gender that leaves out all degrees of variation, that continues to place each one of us in a defined box. It leaves out so many very real people that are really living and moving about in the world today. Think about the people in your life. Are all of the women in your life, do they belong only in the home? Do you know men who seek to care for their children, to live affectional lives and not just only in the intellect? Do you know people with varying gender expressions, varying relationships, who are living and moving and breathing in the world now? The people that we are called to love. And can we find them in this passage? This is why I'm actually not that interested in trying to find myself as a woman, a preaching woman nonetheless, in the illustrations that Swedenborg uses or in the sparse passages from Swedenborg and the Bible that refer to the feminine nature of God, or even in the stories of women in the Bible themselves, because it feels clear to me that this story is missing something. It's missing something very big. It's missing me. It's telling a story of a God journeying with a people who are deeply invested in systems of injustice without their knowledge, where men and women exist separated by a wide chasm, not just a horizontal divide, but a vertical one, where men hold the primary position and women exist as support, a counterpart, a complement. This is true in the biblical story, and it's certainly also true in Swedenborg's time. And at the same time, while all of this is true, still with all of these challenges, of looking to this holy story that is embedded in a time and a place where we did not exist, and the identities that we hold did not exist, still, this story is what I have committed my life to. It is the story that draws us here in these pews. Some would say that we are all a little bit crazy for turning back again and again to these ancient stories that sometimes without their knowledge put forward views of the world that are not in line with our views today. Maybe we are all crazy, but we are not the only ones. While some look to this ancient story and seek to recreate the ancient culture it depicts, or at least the aspects of that culture that they are trying to hold on to, many others find in this ancient story a story of change, of overcoming, of a God continually breaking in and making things new, of a God come to earth to show us that this world and its story is not the whole divine story, and that God wants something much bigger than we can see where we stand today, a new heaven and a new earth. So when I read this ancient story, when I preach about it, when I look to it for guidance, I start with where I stand today, with what I know to be true, that I am a strong, empowered woman with wisdom and experience, with freedoms that my ancestors never knew, with a desire to be a part of this divine story. This is the vantage point from which I read. And when I read from this vantage point, I read the whole story. I don't look just to the story of Sarah or the story of that brooding hen to find myself. I don't just say, there I am, and that is enough. I'll settle with this little corner of the story that's for me. No way. The whole story is for me, as it is for everyone, male, female, non-binary, and we all have to wrestle with the inequalities that it presents. I think if women feel they need to look to women in the scriptures to find themselves, and men need to look to men, then we are all very, very lost. This kind of divide is what will keep us stuck in this misogynist system that we are seeking to overcome. And none of us, men or women, will ever be free. Instead, together, let's see how God led these people. And if men played a larger role than they do now, let's see that as another injustice that God is leading us out of. And if this story is going to be the ground of our spiritual life together, today, let's be sure, be very sure, that we are reading it to be reminded and comforted by the activity of God, the activity of an overturning God, and not to try to relive the good old days. Humankind was created as God's reflection. In the divine image, God created them, male and female. God made them. We are all equally created in the image of God. All people of all genders, of all gender expressions. The biblical story and all the stories in it speak fully and completely to my story as well as it does to theirs. To my brothers, to my non-binary friends, to my intersex friends' stories, to the story of humankind. The biblical story is an ancient story told through ancient mores, through ancient characters and ancient plot points. It is not a story told so that we will always live like those people, but a story told so that we will see how God freed them and how God can free us. If we today, in the lives that we live, were to have somehow shown up in that ancient story long ago, if Jesus had spoken directly to someone like me, or really someone like any of you, they all would have thought him completely insane. God speaks to us in our time and in our place, and it is vital that we listen to how God is speaking to us now, and that all voices are included in that discernment. Amen.